All right, hello, and welcome to today's webinar, the 10 most exploited MITRE attack techniques, why hackers rely on them, and what you can do about this. My name is Robert Lacer. I'm on the marketing team here at Picus. I'll be your host and moderator. First, some housekeeping items. Please ask questions in chat, and we'll do our best to get those answered in line during the session. Anything we don't get to, we'll do during the Q&A portion at the end. And we'd also like to encourage you to make any suggestions you may have for future webinar topics, anything that this might inspire. And then lastly, any product or support specific questions should be directed to your customer success representative. So, okay, let's get rolling. I'd like to introduce you to our panel for today's discussion. From Picus, we have Hüseyin Can Yüceel, our security research lead and co-author of the Picus Red Report 2025. With over a decade in offensive security and threat intelligence, he's a prolific writer. The Red Report 2025 is his 150th Picus publication, which is pretty impressive. We're also thrilled to welcome Jamie Williams, a threat researcher at Unit 42. Previously at MITRE, he led the MITRE ATT&CK development and advanced security research. With his expertise in cyber threat intelligence, Jamie brings some very valuable insights, and we hope you enjoy the session. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start with this. What is the Red Report and why should you find it valuable? So the Red Report breaks down over 1 million files we analyzed last year, and 93% of those were malicious. And what it reveals is how threats are evolving and what that means for security teams. And the goal is to provide the insights needed to stay ahead, strengthen your defenses, and manage cyber risks more effectively. So we hope you find these 3 takeaways as you listen today. The first is the 10 most used attack techniques in 2024, why adversaries love them, and what you can do about those and how those are evolving. Why credential theft surged 3x from 8% to 25%, and how attackers weaponize stolen credentials. And then lastly, actionable strategies you can take to validate defenses against the real-world threats highlighted in the Red Report. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our audience. Hey guys, can you give our audience an executive summary of what's in the report?
Thanks, Rob. In our research, we found that malware attacks have evolved into highly sophisticated and coordinated operations. Attackers now run multi-stage attack techniques to bypass traditional security controls and achieve their objectives. Rather than relying on isolated methods, adversaries now integrate process injection, credential dumping, lateral movement, and data exfiltration techniques seamlessly so they can achieve their objectives. These multi-layered attacks are carefully designed to evade detection while enabling attackers to maintain long-term persistent access to their target networks.
And honestly, I think I love this kind of research, but more importantly, I love the publication and sharing of it because it really does. There's a lot of really valuable data points in the report. Like you said, top 10 techniques, some are new, some are old. But I think more importantly, it helps us really see the trends and patterns where I think we'll get into it a little bit later. But one of the big things, especially thinking back to how this data is compiled, like you looking at malware and looking at capabilities within malware, really does unearth some, trends leaning towards, as you said, credentials leading the way, and how that changes how we not only think about, the cyber criminal community in terms of, our credentials being stolen by stealer malware, but also what does that enable from both the, password sprays, brute force, attack on VPNs. We can really start to take these data points and these capabilities and draw it into a holistic understanding of what is the threat landscape telling us and how do we orient our defenses to better defeat these specific TTPs.
And so as we talk about this, we're going to have a pretty big mix of experience levels with pen testing in the audience. So for those who are newer to it, what's the best way to understand and approach it effectively?
I love that question. And I always preach start small. I think when you start thinking about adversaries and scenarios, whether it's ransomware or data loss or disruption, named actors, certain malware families, whatever it may be, it can get overwhelming, and it can be very hard to see the picture and really understand where you can make a change. So rather than trying to solve everything overnight and overburden yourself, I like to think of it like as the crawl, walk, run model of, look at lists like this, find the individual techniques, whether it's, this is a perfect, we have 10 things we can look at, not even thinking about adversaries or certain trends yet. Let's just take a look at these and see, process injection. What do we have currently in terms of defenses, controls? What should we be doing? Is this something that we have the resources to think about? Maybe it's something that, very often with risk, we just have to accept it and say it's maybe, a 2-3 year plans we'll build into the future. But let's start to assess where we are currently and maybe even do some, maybe smaller testing just to verify where we are or get some data. And then as you mature and kind of as you advance, start to stitch those together and say, okay, we know we have for process injection and command and script interpreter, how do those combine? Where are we seeing adversaries kind of, put those together into a unique behavior? And then slowly over time, you go from those kind of almost atomic, discrete behaviors to complex chains of activity to, okay, now that I know where I am in terms of looking at all the Lego and individual like building blocks, I can compare myself against an APT-29 or a Luma Stealer or whatever the threat of the day is. But I think starting from that bottom up is going to help you kind of build a foundation, and more importantly, a data-driven foundation versus, what are we doing about ransomware? It's going to be a very, very tough question to answer if you haven't done that foundational kind of investigation and assessments.
Got it. And then, Hüseyin, if you talk to maybe some of the specific techniques in the top 10 and reflecting on what Jamie said about, starting small and building, how should the audience look at that top 10? And are all of these easily addressed by, let's say, beginner to pen testing, or is there a particular place we should start? And then maybe just walk through each one of these.
Yeah, when we doing this research, we had something in mind that it should sound both to target both to beginners and the experts. For the beginners, it's a great roadmap to utilize MITRE ATT&CK and improve their security posture. For experts, it's a much more focused research showing the procedure examples and the state of the threat landscape. That's why these reports, whether Red Report or similar reports, is a great way to utilize MITRE ATT&CK framework on their end. This year, we saw that there is a great dominance on top 10 techniques, and 93% of the actions we saw in the field are related to these top 10s. And we have the usual suspects, like process injection, command and scripted interpreter, impaired defenses, because adversaries are trying to use the tools in your built-in operating systems and networks, and also try to bypass your defenses without creating any alerts, so they can operate more freely on their end. However, this year we saw that there's a great increase in targeting credentials in the password stores, because we are much more using the password stores to secure credentials, and it's a valuable target for adversaries.
Okay. And in terms of building blocks, to Jamie's comment about, use these as building blocks, how does that relate to that process, and how should the audience look at where this fits in that sequence of building?
Actually, if I were to start from zero, and I would choose a single technique and try to understand that, try to build my defenses around that. It depends on your threat landscape, because it's unique to your organization, your needs. For example, if you are in a financial organization living in Latin region, it's a different landscape than someone in healthcare in US. So depending on that, you should research your threat landscape and understand it. And after that, you will come up with several techniques that highlighted in several researchers. For example, you will probably see process injection in many threat intelligence reports. So after reading several of them, you will see that, yeah, I should start with process injection or
Absolutely
something
agree.
else. Yeah,
absolutely agree. And I think the other part of this, like you said, it's a balance of like that threat modeling art of, like you said, looking at, reports and threats and trends and saying, okay, these are what the adversaries are doing, process injection, command and script interpreter, all those being very prevalent. But it's also, to your point, kind of looking internally and saying, what does this look like in our environment? What command and scripting interpreters do we have on our host? Do we have Python installed? Do we have Bash? Do we have, command, PowerShell, all these different shells? And then same thing with, working down this list. It's that combination of what is an adversary capable of and how does that compare to what that would look like in our environment? And exactly to your point, I think that kind of starts to maybe not answer these questions, but at least I think part of the problem is just asking the right question and getting that conversation started with exactly as you said, hey, credentials and password stores. Maybe that's something I'm not familiar with. In our environment, where are users storing passwords? Are they storing it in browsers? Or do we have, KeyPass or pick your favorite, password provider? Like, what does that look like? And then what are the preventative controls we have? And I think that's where you really start to see not only, that gap of where we are, where we want to be, but how do we use assessments and red teaming and pen testing to maybe close that gap and kind of really understand where we are in terms of our posture?
And in terms of speaking of pen testing, is of these and looking at pen testing in general, where do you guys see the split between that top 10 list and just in general, what you might consider for automated pen testing versus what would need to stay in the realm of security analysts doing the work, manually, which manually is not a bad word. It's just where they have to focus their attention because you're probably not going to automate it.
Yeah, manual implies resource intensive. So I'm right there with you, but I'm of the school of thought of do it manual the first time, do it right. Figure out what you actually need, because I think sometimes that manual effort leads the way in terms of doing an assessment and executing these techniques it's scientific, but it's so artistic in terms of understanding exactly, as I said, hey, process injection compared to what adversaries are capable of and what would it look like in our environment. That's going to take a lot of context, a lot of research, a lot of development, a lot of, things that just aren't as simple as automation. But I think where automation comes into play is once we can almost productize what a good, representation of that behavior looks like, now automation helps us scale it and repeat it. So I think that would be the strategy I would say, especially thinking about that maturity model, is figure out how to test these, whether it's one technique or a combination of techniques or an entire adversary emulation plan, figure out what good looks like. And then let's let technology kind of say, hey, let's put that in the hands of more people with an automated framework or whatever we're using to kind of accelerate and enable more wins.
That sounds very practical. Hüseyin, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I agree with Jamie. The automation helps us a lot. But however, we need to first understand what we are automating. That's why we need to understand the basics and learn the basics and how to implement them. And after that, we should look into how we can scale it and automate it. After that, it's a valuable thing. However, first we need to understand what it does, what's it's aimed for. For example, if you are trying to automate an attack simulation, you need to first understand that what that attack is doing. After that, you will see that whether it is targeting you, targeting your environment, it's affecting you or not. That's the important parts before thinking about automation and scaling. You need to first understand the basics, then think about the automation.
So would it also be safe to say it's not automation for automation's sake?
Yeah.
Okay. So in looking at this report, right, we talked about what was big in 2024. What's shifted there, and are there any trends? What's been consistent and what maybe came up as a surprise or of special concern?
When we did our research, we see the similar results to compare to previous year's reports. However, this year we saw that there's a significant increase in credential theft because credentials are very much used in nearly every environment to give access to sensitive information or system. So that's why adversaries are targeting them, especially due to password policies and password complexity. Organizations and users are moved to password managers. That's why adversaries are trying to target them and exploit them so they can access multiple systems at once by targeting a single system. That was a surprising part for us.
So,
and I think that aligns with like the broader take of like what we're seeing, across most industries and, adversary space is exactly what you said. Crime, looking at this list, it really does kind of ooze crime. And I think, that does beget credentials, but also a little bit of automation to your point earlier of, we know that credentials can enable a lot of impact and breaches. We're seeing, vast deployments of stealer malware that are harvesting these credentials, whether it's, from a user's keystrokes, a password manager, logs, whatever it may be, and then piping that over to botnets and things that are automating those breaches and scanning. So I think it is, I love the art here is fantastic, but I love the meaning behind it of this is, a very heist criminal, ecosystem. And I think that aligns a lot with the way this research was conducted in terms of looking at, I imagine, I don't have the numbers, but I imagine a lot of the malware samples you're uncovering are kind of those ad hoc criminal malware families that are doing kind of stitching things together to piece, full campaigns.
Even with different motivations, adversaries are trying to target these credentials so they can access multiple systems without creating any alerts in the system. So they can stay there as much as they want, whether it's a ransomware group trying to encrypt the sensitive files or a cyber espionage group trying to steal those files. In both cases, gathering valid credentials and valid accounts helps them collect all the data or encrypt all the data without any alerts. They can do whatever they want as long as they want.
Right. And to Rob's earlier point, it's not, even on the criminal adversary side, it's not automation for the sake of automation. It's automation to scale and have better ROI and all the manual efforts. Once you figure out how to steal passwords from a password manager, scale that, get the return on investment, and then kind of rinse and repeat. So it kind of makes sense. It's interesting to see how a lot of the paradigms we see on both offensive and defender perspectives really do align. So it almost at times feels like an arms race. So it's really interesting to see, especially as a defender looking outward, trends or insights that show which direction the adversaries are leaning and thinking, so that you can kind of not only kind of pursue the things that you're working on and things you're focusing on, but make sure you're covering down on whatever their next chess move is.
Yeah, so in that regard, my favorite topic, AI, which has been bandied about as the next big thing in cyber, whether you're talking about offensive and defensive, and really a lot of fear around it and a lot of discussions around it, both from a generative perspective and from an agentic perspective. So with that in mind, what is, based on what's in the report and what we thought we were going to see, how is it being played within specifically on the attacker side? What are we seeing there?
In the report, we saw that adversaries are using AI to polish their techniques. However, they are not creating new or unique techniques out of AI. AI helps them scale and automate their techniques and increase their impact. However, it's not creating something out of thin air. So you need to first think the technique, try to find a way to exploit a system. However, AI does not help on that front. However, if you found an exploit, it can help you weaponize it or scale it or automate it in a way that it helps your motivations on objectives.
Right. 100% agree. I think, especially when you think from the malware perspective, AI is going to be more of a co-pilot of, like you said, cleaning things up, generating some baseline code that, a human developer might have to clean up, maybe obfuscating things in new ways. But I think, especially from the thinking about adversaries and the offensive risk, I'm more afraid of AI, and as it relates to like social engineering, in terms of generating phishing content, generating, not deep fakes, but being able to simulate personas. Because I think the part that is kind of implicit in this list is the humanity of it, and a lot of the big risk to a lot of the human side of this is trust. We're just, whether you're clicking on a link or you're not, you're running this file or you're not, you're navigating this website, there's a whole nother layer that we need to think about. And I think that's where AI really plays the biggest part of, whether I click this link or open this attachment, there's a lot of kind of implicit communication that I think AI is getting a little bit more mature at in terms of building and establishing, how many, I go to my phone right now and go to my spam folder, I have a bunch of, your package wasn't delivered, click this ugly looking link. That's, I think we as a community, even outside of the Defender bubble, we're pretty comfortable ignoring those versus maybe, AI doing some research on me, sending something that's a little bit more crafted, a little bit more nuanced. That's where I think we're going to have a huge challenge in terms of thinking about how do we actually, it isn't going to be a fully engineered solution. We need to think about this a little bit more holistically and how do we respond and defeat this threat?
Interesting. So as we look at this, do we see really any change in terms of motivations with attackers? Has, the typical crown jewels targeting changed? What's your sense there?
Actually, adversaries are always on the lookout for your sensitive data. The way they exploit it is different. However, the target is same. For example, for ransomware attackers, it's encrypting sensitive files. For APT groups, it's trying to either delete your sensitive files so they can hinder your operations, or they try to steal those files so they can do espionage on you. That's why crown jewels are not changed. However, the way they target it, the way they access it, it has changed and evolved over time. In our previous reports, we saw that they are much more stealthier as time passes. They are chaining more advanced techniques back to back to stay silent and have a persistent access into your environment, so they can do their thing in their terms, so they can ransomware you, they can steal your files, and that's the same.
And really, when I look at this list, 100% agree. The word that comes to mind is exactly as you said, like opportunistic targeting. Like, I think what's really, like, whether it's creds or, vulnerabilities, I think what we're seeing is a lot of adversaries, rather than trying to, impose the way that they want to operate, they're looking for what weaknesses are you exposing. They're going to take whatever opportunity is available to them and then make the most of it. And I think that's, especially when you think about credentials and scanning, and a lot of what you're seeing here, especially in the financially motivated actor space, they're looking for, at scale with automation, how to make the most money. And that's going to be by volume, unfortunately. So I think the biggest lesson is, again, thinking about how can we build up better walls and protect ourselves and have these controls, but how do we make sure not only are we not giving them, backdoors and just obvious wins, but more importantly, how do we race to figuring, change happens, systems are very complex, there will obviously be weaknesses and vulnerabilities, but it's almost like, how do we start to embrace finding those and remediating those before an adversary has an ability to, especially considering that they are invested in that space and they are scanning you continuously, looking for those weaknesses. So it's almost a foot race every time one of those emerges.
Okay, and so with this in mind, right, before we go to Q&A, what, if we just kind of iterate through, if it's crawl, walk, run, some things are more real than others in that report. There's these motivations that play into this. So if you stepped into your average organization, which define average, but if you stepped in your average organization this afternoon, what would be the steps, as a consultant, what would be the steps you would recommend for these organizations to take to protect themselves? Like just a finger roll of 1 through 5, what should they do?
Oh, that's a big one. I think especially if it was day zero, just like before we get to something more strategic, it'd be thinking about, without ignoring insider threats and all the things that could come from that realm, let's focus on external. What are all the ways we're interacting with people systems, people that we don't trust? Whether do we have web servers? Do we have gateway devices? Email. Let's think about all those vectors and think about all the ways that an adversary could go from outside to inside. And then, like, again, without even changing anything, let's just sit down, let's block off an afternoon and talk through kind of what those mechanics look like and then what controls we have in place. And I think even just having that conversation, you're going to, again, start to see some successes that maybe oh, wow, we're doing this great over here, but you might find some gaps. And I think that's going to set a lot of strategy in terms of, wow, these successes, we need to make sure they stay successful. Let's maintain them. Let's start to build out assessment plans to, regularly, continuously test them and make sure they're doing what they do and maybe make improvements. But then also these gaps, let's start to understand the risk, the impact. What could happen if, hey, we have this web server over here, or if it was compromised, it has this data, yada, yada, yada. Let's kind of just talk through those scenarios and really understand that risk. And then from there, we can almost divide and conquer and work through it. But I think to put that succinctly, I think the understanding of, again, getting back to that threat modeling idea, what is an external adversary that's, either opportunistically just happens to, land on us or has targeting us? What would they see? What would they think about? What would they do and why? And let's compare that to how it actually, materialize in our environment that we control. And let's start to close the gap in terms of, we're not going to solve everything, but let's at least map out what that might look like and make sure we're kind of playing on our terms.
Okay. So we have some interesting questions that have come in that I would like y'all to address. Now, the first one that came in, I'll actually take first if we're going to even address this one here, but it says, I have seen most people do not understand the differences, pros and cons between pen testing and BAS. Can you elaborate on this and explain how they address TTPs differently? Now, before I have y'all answer that, I want to let the audience know that we have a webinar coming up in the next probably 4 weeks that's going to address this one exactly. So stay tuned for that. But if you all want to take a crack at that question in this forum, that would be great.
I can answer this one. In the pen testing scenario, you go and start with a scope and start with a machine and an initial access machine, and you go from that and try to enumerate weaknesses, find those weaknesses, exploit them to achieve a greater goal. In breach and attack simulation case, you know what you are trying to simulate, and you try to assess in your environment. For example, let's assume the latest CISA alert was about ghost ransomware. You are trying to simulate ghost ransomware in your environment with breach and attack simulation, so you can test your security posture against that cyber threat. Or in the pen testing case, you are not trying to attack with the ghost ransomware, but we are trying to achieve those techniques by exploiting and chaining the different vulnerabilities one by one. That's the subtle difference between those.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. I think it kind of almost goes back to what we said earlier about the manual versus automation, where, like you said, manual is not only going to be a little more resource intensive, but it's going to have creativity. Like you said, it's going to be, hey, the person on keyboard can see the environment, make dynamic decisions, kind of, be a little bit, less constricted versus, something automated is going to, again, maybe be a little bit, like you said, known behaviors that have already been tested. So you're getting, known behavior, you're a little bit reactive, but also it's been tested, it's been validated, and also it's scale. So I think there's no better approach. It's just understanding where you are and using whatever the tools or process that makes the most sense. But again, I think it kind of really ties to what we said earlier, is they play together really, really nicely. Because if you're doing that manual pen test, you are creating new ideas, creating new processes that can be automated, scaled, repeated. So they kind of almost form a really good development pipeline.
Okay, cool. So I have another question in Q&A. It's one of the earlier ones. Can you give some successful working examples of those automation scenarios? In other words, what areas and techniques are great fits natively to be automated?
Actually, non-TTPs are great to be automated because you know their impact, you know the expected outcome and the mitigations, so you can automate those techniques. However, as James said, if you are looking for creativity, you are looking for something unique, something you did not anticipate, pen testing is a great tool for that, because in that case you can add human ingenuity into it. Or in the breach and attack simulation case or attack simulation case, you are trying to replicate what is known, what's at your hands. So one is trying to come up with a new dish. The other one is applying this and creating a dish out of some cookbook. That's the subtle difference.
Love that analogy. And I think the philosophy we always had was once you do something, like you said, once you cook a really good meal, do you think you're ever going to want to cook this again? And if so, like almost everything is a good automation candidate if you actually worked the way you thought it did. But to your point, you definitely kind of have to do that front, R&D work just to get to that point of eating the meal, understanding if it tastes good, and then figuring out, hey, is there too many ingredients that take too long, or is this something that we could package up? And next week, the week after, my cousin across the world, are they going to actually enjoy this as well? Or was this just this one-time thing? Maybe it was a good time and we'll never see it again.
Okay, next question. Appreciate if you could speak more of protecting process injection.
Let me open up the report because I exactly wrote which event IDs you should look for. For example, in the DLL injection case, where is that? Let me search for it.
While you search, I think one of the interesting things with a lot of these behaviors is they're not inherently malicious. Like process injection sounds really bad, but it exists in Windows for a reason. It's something that legitimate processes use. So at least before we get to the more authoritative scientific answer, at least in my opinion, from what I've seen, it all comes down to context. Like you can't just, if you went to a system and blocked all process injection, it would be inevitable that applications and software would begin to fail. So you really have to start to think about, especially I love that you're already going at this from a detection strategy perspective, thinking about, okay, what does benign normal activity look like compared to what are the things that, are red flags for something malicious? And there's so many different metadata and so many different ways to approach this, but it almost gets back to the idea of like threat hunting, which is like baselining normal and then figuring out, okay, if I understand what normal looks like, I understand what hay looks like, I can find the needles in the haystack. And, as Hüseyin was saying, like, are there certain, this process does a lot of process injection, but typically to these, target processes. So anything outside of that might be suspicious, or certain injection patterns. So I guess it all kind of comes down to, can you understand and visualize the behavior, but then also think about the telemetry that you have and align that and say, okay, can I, at least at a very, very high level, start to carve off, this is typically what good or okay looks like, and these are the ones that, kind of are outside of that mold. And then how do I, best as possible, start to efficiently figure out abnormal versus very clearly bad.
All right.
I couldn't find the exact PDF, but I will share that one with you. In the previous year, at Report 2024, we wrote down which event IDs you should look for particular techniques. However, as Jamie said, a process injection is a valid technique in valid cases, legitimate cases. However, you should look for something malicious, for example, malicious payloads, malicious techniques, malicious commands in your event IDs, so you can identify those adversary actions. I will share that document with you privately.
Okay, another interesting question. We see a lot of targeting of external services. Do you see a lot of focus on vulnerabilities or more on exposed VPN, brute force, compromised credentials, etc., and websites?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the latest CISA alert was about Ghost ransomware, and they are opportunistic ransomware group that targets external-facing, outdated services. They are especially looking for known vulnerabilities and try to exploit them. They are not creating any zero-day to attack your environment, attack their targets. They are targeting known VPN vulnerabilities, known web service vulnerabilities, so they can infiltrate you, because you cannot shut down those external facing applications because you need to operate for your legitimate business operations. So they are especially targeting those attack surfaces. However, those are known systems, so you have an advantage that you can patch those systems, and they should not be vulnerable in any case.
100% agree. It's unfortunately neither of those are going away. So like you said, it's just responsibly managing the threat. And again, I 100% co-sign there are some apex predators out there that are working with 0 days. The majority of exploitation are, CVE assigned things that, and I think that really gets into the value of doing a lot of this testing is you're not going to go to your vulnerability management team and tell them to patch everything. Now it's just too much work, even for a small network. So you really have to use this assessment and threat intelligence and all the other insights that we have to maybe prioritize and steer towards the biggest ROI, which exactly to Hussein's point is understanding not only, not every vulnerability and everything that needs to be patched, but where are the ones that could actually result in, RCE or, access or things that we're actually more worried about. We can kind of work our way down the list very, very intentionally.
So here's a fun question, the kind of thing I'd like to ask, and feel free to tap out. Do you see any potential threats with quantum computing?
I saw that in the list and I was wondering if you're going to go there. Biggest one for me, I think it is emerging. It's something that I think a lot of, especially in the researcher space, people are playing around with. I think the biggest one is going to be attacks on crypto. I mean that in the more traditional sense, cryptography. A lot of our algorithms are built to have, certain strength and robustness, and with the, current or at least projected computing power in mind. So, it's hard to tell exactly what it will look like, but I think at least initially trying to pair that technology with where it could apply to the threat landscape, I think our ability to, maintain and, the confidentiality of data could be really interesting. And I mean, there's all other, you could think about hashing algorithms and other things like that could be out there. But I think, at least for me, the most looming threat is our ability to, safely encrypt and secure data at rest or data in transit.
We are preparing for post-quantum encryption algorithms, so we are safe on that because it's one of the most well-researched subject in the field, the quantum computing and encryption. So in the near future, I think we are safe on that side. Yeah, so nothing to worry.
Okay,
it's a lot of math, though. I've looked at that. I don't know if you have a background in some of the linear algebra things. It's like, it makes my head hurt.
That.
Okay, good.
That's right. Which one of these MITRE attacks can be used for exploiting an Apache vulnerability?
I don't think it's on this list, but it's going to be exploitation of public-facing infrastructure. I think it's T1190 in initial access. But I imagine, especially given how your research went, you're probably not seeing a lot of that in malware samples. It's probably what enables these malware samples to be delivered to host.
Okay.
Yeah, generally adversaries are first exploit public-facing applications, then deploy malware. That's why we do not see many initial access techniques in the data sample, because that's not how malware works in that environment.
Okay. Another specific example, specific question. What level of attention is being given to exploit algorithms related to TLS 1.0, the deprecated versions on web servers and Diffie-Hellman protocols?
I think we mentioned that in the fifth technique of the red report, impaired defenses. The adversaries are trying to downgrade these protocols and algorithms so they can exploit known vulnerabilities. I think you should look for downgrade attack in the MITRE ATT&CK and the red report.
Okay. And then one last question we have here, which is, how does Picus help with testing public exposed services using these technologies, which I think it's in the EASM side of the equation on attack surface?
We have attack surface validation module, and also in our security validation module, we have initial access techniques. For example, we have web exploitation techniques. We stimulate known exploitation of known vulnerabilities in web services. For example, we have one of the most popular one was Log4Shell for a couple of years, and we have many others in that regard, and we can simulate initial access techniques for publicly exposed services.
Okay, great. Well, thank you guys. It's been fantastic. I enjoyed it myself. I'm going to put up this fun graphic, and what I'm going to do is drop a link into chat where you can go to the Picus website, pull down a copy of the red report, and take a look for yourselves. It's very extensive, but I think you'll find it very interesting.
Also,
so with
fantastic art. Gotta give a credit to the artist. That is really cool.
Yeah.
So kudos.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks to our guest, Jamie Hüseyin. And we'll look forward to seeing some of you in our audience in a future webinar. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks for having me.